Well, thank you very much, Jack, for that insightful presentation. And I really like and greatly appreciate these examples too about just how dramatically we could reform both personal and corporate income taxes in a revenue neutral way. Some pretty significant reductions in personal income tax rates need not come at the cost of overall drops in revenue. But I guess on that point, I have kind of two questions. But first, I'll remind everyone that that QR code on the little three-sided thing, live Q&A, if you scan that, I'll be able to see the questions here. But in the meantime, maybe I'll dig into the last point you made about potentially now being a moment to consider broader policy changes than we usually do. And tax reform itself is often quite politically difficult. And I wonder what you see normally as the biggest barriers to meaningful change in Canada, and whether or not those particular barriers are still going to be present even in this moment.
Yeah, well, as I wanted to show you what would happen if you restructured without changing the amount of revenue that one raises. That's just an exercise to say that you can even restructure the tax system to be better, even at the current level of taxes that we're raising. But actually, I think in light of what's happening vis-a-vis U.S. policy now, we have probably a bigger issue, and that is that we're likely going to need to either spend some money to help disaffected workers, but also if we really want to change the way things are happening in Canada, I think we need to think about significant tax cuts as well. So one of the things that might be doing is that, for example, on the spending side, if you cut back, especially some of the corporate business subsidies, because you don't need them anymore, and a number of certain spending programs that you can afford a significant tax cut, and I think that's in that case, I think you could also do the restructuring much more easily. The toughest part of tax reform is when you're trying to do it in a revenue neutral way, because you're always going to create winners and losers. But if you have a tax cut at the same time, you're going to create a lot more winners than losers. The simplified tax credit, for example, that I gave, there are no losers, even, but there would be a revenue cost, and so you got to make it up in a certain way. But I think, and that has to be made up with some other revenues or some spending cuts as well. So I think that's why, if any time we have some room for tax reform, it's probably going to be in the next couple of years. Why? Because we need to do it, and we need to rejuvenate the private sector, and that's been that poor investment record is a perfect example of that.
So then, digging into that a little further, if we were to go beyond revenue neutrality as a tax change, and this comparison between personal tax cuts and corporate income tax cuts, do you have a sense or do you have a view in terms of what would be most economically beneficial? I see the example you provided of lowering the top rate from 33 to 26, but then I think about the scale of the top rate differences between Ontario and Michigan or Pennsylvania that is on the order of 14 percentage points, and even an even larger gap between Washington and British Columbia. So is personal tax rates and the effect it has on retention and attraction of skilled workers more or less relevant than corporate tax rate changes in order to attract more investment?
Well, first of all, let me mention that the average top personal rate in the United States right now is about 46% across all states, and that's based on the distribution of personal income across the U.S. And of course, there's some states that are lower and some that are higher. Same on the corporate tax side. We've got to remember Texas, Ohio, states that are really important to us in terms of our competition. Texas, Ohio, Washington, they don't have corporate income taxes at the state level. So their corporate income tax rate is 21%, while ours is, the lowest is Alberta at 23%, but most of them are over 25%. So we're not particularly, that competitive even in that case. And then on the personal tax side, what worries me, I mean, first of all, I think the corporate tax is very powerful. I think that's, you know, if I did a big bang corporate tax reform, as I suggest here, that would be probably my #1 priority. But I think we have to remember that populations are migrant. And and one of the problems we have in Canada is that we don't have data on emigration. There's lots of data on immigration, but there's no data on emigration. And I've pleaded with Statistics Canada in the past, and there may be some issues involved with the quality of data, but everybody on the income tax form, when they depart from Canada, they indicate that, and in fact, some people have to pay departure tax when they leave Canada. And so we know when they become non-residents. Main point is that because we don't collect data, then economists don't understand whether these personal taxes have any impact on actual people moving. The one piece of data that people do have is they look at the U.S. data, and we know that there's been an increase in the number of people going to the U.S., but we still don't know the motivation. And there's various motivations. There are better opportunities in the U.S. There could be family issues that drive it. Students are going there to get educated, et cetera, et cetera. But there has been an increase in the past few years. The question is, are we starting to develop a brain drain, in part due to the fact that, as you pointed out, personal incomes per capita are now much higher than in Canada, so the salaries are much more attractive. But is it also due to taxes and other factors? There's a piece that I haven't published yet, but I worked with Neil Seaman on, where we've been able to use a company called Rewe that does this phenomenal work on being able to use all the media and social media sites to develop very well done polling that's even better than the pollsters on what we did is we looked at the motivation for why people move. And it was quite interesting. We had 200,000 responses of people who said they moved to the United States in the past 3 years or knew somebody that moved in the past 3 years. Out of that 200,000, 100,000 weren't really relevant. And I think because they didn't know anyone. I think that was the reason. But the other 100,000, I think it was around, if I recall, around 60% was because of better opportunities, or 50%. Healthcare, surprisingly, explained 30% of the movements, including younger people, which really surprised me. And that was for it was kind of equally split between access to healthcare and quality of healthcare for why they moved to the United States. We were quite surprised by that, how important the healthcare one was. And then taxation. Corporate taxation was not an important reason for people to move, and that's not surprising because you can move a company, you don't have to move yourself. But personal taxes were about 15% of those responses and did have an impact. And as we know, some of us, anyone who works as a tax practitioner will tell you about the number of people that they've handled to move not only to the United States but to other countries as well. And so we don't know enough about how much tax is motivating that, but certainly one of the reasons that we've worried about high personal tax rates is partly the migration issue that we have no data on, and also the concern about the impact on innovation and productivity, because you have smaller companies and entrepreneurs who are starting up, and when they see this barrier of higher taxes, has an impact. And the other thing we have to remember is that even in the acquisition of human capital, when you have a very progressive income tax rate, that actually imposes a cost on the acquisition of human capital, because the cost of when you're making an investment in, people make an investment in their own education, the cost of it is their lost time, which at that point they don't have as much income, and the tax savings aren't very much with their, or the tax isn't very much at that point. But then when they work, or when they start working, and when their incomes grow at a later time, they're taxed with a much higher marginal tax rate. And so when you measure that, you actually find there's a very high effective tax rate on the acquisition of human capital. when you have the more progressive the tax system is. And so that again has an impact on productivity.
So I think I will turn to some audience questions which are flowing in, so thanks for the great activity. I also see that you have discovered the ability to upvote these questions, and so I'm going to pick one of the two that are currently tied now for leading in terms of popularity, and I think it's quite a good one. And the tax reform is difficult and complex. It's a challenge to communicate. It's a political challenge, not the least of which because of sometimes winners and losers. And recently this questioner observes, and I think correctly, that governments haven't really shown a fortitude to act in the face of those challenges. And given that I think there is a need to act now, what's the process that governments should pursue larger scale tax reform within? Should we have a panel? I know you've chaired several through your career, or a royal commission, McDonald Commission style, or should they just proceed with reforms at the next budget opportunity? And I think process matters in the sense that the BC HST debate, I think, really demonstrated how important process is to successfully undertaking tax reform.
Yes, well, actually, GST probably could have been done sooner if there, if there wasn't, because I was around at the time of finance when the decision was made to delay it to 1991. But it did proceed after a number of years of study. But if it had proceeded in 1987 with personal and corporate tax reform, where you're replacing the manufacturer sales tax, which has made it easier to bring in the GST, but also cutting personal and corporate taxes at the same time, probably would have been a little easier to bring in the GST in 1987 compared to 1991, especially after a major recession, as we had moved to inflation targeting and very high interest rates at that time with a very severe recession. That's when the GST came in. Bad timing for sure. Again, if you're doing tax cuts, I think it's easier to do a bigger bang reform, but also if people feel we really need the change. And the question is this now a time where people feel we need change? And I think that's important. How would I proceed? I think the last thing I would do is have a Royal Commission on Taxation. First of all, it'll take 4 years and 15,000 studies, and then you still have consultations that go on. I think the best thing would be to have a tax panel that comes out with a report that could be open for discussions and consultations. That's what we did when I did it for Paul Martin back in 96 and 97. But there the conditions were tougher because the government at that point was still in deficit. We had to do a revenue neutral reform, which of course meant that there are going to be certain people that were going to be upset with some of the changes, obviously. But in the end, what happened is that we did undertake corporate tax reform, and the Department of Finance was very convinced to move ahead, and so were the provinces. They actually followed the same principles, and it started in 2000, where corporate tax rates were being reduced, and there was a review of the capital cost allowances to make them more neutral, and a number of other things, and that change did happen, and that's because people felt it needed to get done. In 1980s, when I was at finance in 84 to 86, God, I'm showing my age. Anyway, when I was there in 84 to 86, Michael Wilson's first budget in 1985, which was not a major consultation approach, he cut capital gains taxes, and he put out a restructuring of the corporate tax, which actually I wrote that paper at that time, that was lowering the corporate income tax rate, getting rid of general investment tax credits, and leaving some other changes for a review. Then the Reagan tax reform came along, and Canada said, oh, we got a crisis on our hands, because Reagan just lowered the top personal rate to 25% from, I think it was 48, 45% or whatever at that time. And Canada said, oh, we got to do personal tax reform now. And then they put out a white paper, Department of Finance. There were lots of discussions around it, but there was significant restructuring of the personal tax at that time. We converted a lot of deductions into credits at that point, and we lowered the top rate quite a bit. I think probably that process could be done within 2 years. And I think that's probably what I would go for, is something akin to what we did 84 to 86, or what happened after 2000. When the 2000, you didn't have the same crisis condition as you had in 87 after the Reagan tax reform in 86, but because people felt change was needed.
That's an excellent point. I've always had a soft spot for a royal commission, but the timing is a good point. That's probably not ideal. There's two questions here that are actually quite similar and by far receiving the most interest, and also a good one in the sense that the U.S. is undertaking their tax changes now, only partially funding them through spending reductions. The bill passed through the House 2 days ago, had $4.5 trillion in tax reductions and $2 trillion in their targeted spending reduction. And so over the next 10 years, they anticipate this will increase the deficit annually on the order of 0.8% of GDP. So not a small increase, especially given where they are now at roughly 5 or 6% of GDP in terms of their current deficit, and a completely unsustainable trajectory. So in Canada, I wonder about how we should think about pursuing tax reductions, whether we should be concerned that it might lead to longer-term fiscal challenges like the U.S. is facing, and especially with an aging population and pressures provincially. Is there a risk here that in pursuing tax competitiveness with the U.S. in particular, it becomes an unsustainable race to the bottom?
Well, first of all, I don't think we'll necessarily have a race to the bottom. We have a very different system. I think the question is what's good for Canada in terms of trying to rejuvenate investment in this country and rejuvenate the economy. And as I said, I think there's more than just tax and spending. In fact, I think deregulation could have a very significant impact on economic growth. In fact, that to me should be probably on top of the agenda for policy changes. But again, I'm arguing that it's almost like we're going to take an attitude open for business. And I had that experience when I was chair of the Alberta Premier's Economic Advisory Council in 2020 during the pandemic, which was just an awful time because you not only had the Russian-Saudi oil price war, but then with the pandemic, oil prices just dropped to $10 a barrel. And the province was in very serious trouble. I mean, I remember after our first meeting, which was a Zoom meeting, I came out and my wife looked at me and she said, "Jack, you're red in the face." And I said, "If you heard what I heard about what's happening to the Alberta economy, you'd be red in the face too." I mean, it was a real crisis. But they put together a very credible plan over 3 months, the government, and it became a Bible for significant investments. There's a whole bunch of things, which some of it included tax, but a lot of the things were, including some spending measures on infrastructure, like new irrigation in southern Alberta and things like that. I think we need, but the main thing is that the province wanted to indicate we're now open for business. And they did carry out spending cuts during that period to bring per capita spending down to the other 3 largest provinces in Canada, which is a tough thing to do. But over that whole period, they not only got their fiscal house in order, but they also were able to carry out the kind of expenditures to really lift the economy, along with the oil price recovery that obviously helped as well. But I think we're kind of in that position right now that we're going to have a tough next 4 years, not only with tariff wars. Tomorrow I'm going to be, as I mentioned, I have a piece on tax wars with the United States. There's going to be issues there. But we are going to be facing a very uncertain time, and businesses are looking to move south, and some are already doing it because there's nothing really attractive to be in Canada relative to the United States. We don't have a competitive advantage, which goes back to my main point, is that we need to create that advantage in Canada where people say, you know what, I'd rather be in Canada, even with the U.S., and their tariffs at this point, but I'd like to be in Canada to service the rest of the world. And I think that, is would be one of the major things that we should try to achieve. I'm not sure I answered the whole question properly. Fiscal side, the deficit.
Yeah.
We could afford we're in a better position in the United States to afford having some deficit, right now. I don't, to me, I think we should be a little bit less panicky about tariffs right now. I mean, it is negative what's going to happen to the Canadian economy in terms of, if we did have a 25% tariff on everything that's being sold to the United States, that definitely will have a negative impact, but it's not like the pandemic. And in fact, we forget that in the past, we've had tariffs. Before 1988, if you look at the numbers, they're much higher than today in terms of effective tariff rates across the world. And so I think, there are things that, we should be a little bit less panicky about in terms of how much we have to run as a deficit, or at least try to do that. But again, I think we also have to look at efficiency in government. And we talk about productivity in the private sector, but we don't talk about productivity in the public sector. And the public sector needs a lot more productivity. In terms of the kind of capital equipment they use, the kind of way that they deliver services, and in fact, there's a lot of efficiencies that could be achieved in the public sector that should be examined as well. And I don't mean bringing in Elon Musk's team, although I did hear Kevin O'Leary, our great Canadian, who was on one program. I was listening to him, and he argues that Musk is not going fast enough. So maybe we should bring in Kevin O'Leary.
I mean, I just think that there's a disorderly way to do it, and a program review, quite successful in the 1990s, effectively doing the same thing,
right,
but in a much more serious and deliberative fashion. But let me dig in a little bit to that last question, though, with specific attention to the Atlantic provinces that are older than the Canadian average, aging more rapidly. Newfoundland and Labrador in the Stackham projections having 1 in 3 individuals over the age of 65 by 2040. They might be in a much more difficult fiscal position than certainly the federal government or many other provinces as well, but also potentially the provinces with the greatest potential economic benefit from tax rate reductions. You referenced some of Bev Dalby's work when he looks at whether or not the corporate tax rate in those provinces is beyond even the revenue maximizing rate. He finds that they indeed all are. Yeah. Nova Scotia even beyond that revenue maximizing rate on the personal side as well. So should we think about tax reform?
And they have high debt.
And high debt. Should we think about tax reform differently for different provinces, or do your prescriptions apply here regardless?
Well, first of all, I think we do have tax collection agreements on the income tax. And so what the federal government does is with the base particularly, is very important for the provinces. And obviously one of the major consultations federal government has to do is work with the provinces on a tax reform. Because even though Quebec and Alberta collect their own corporate income tax, for example, and Quebec its own personal tax, there's a lot of following the federal type base. And the same thing now applies to the GST and the HST. But the provinces, we forget in Canada that provinces collect more revenues than the federal government. And they do have a lot of their own levers, and they certainly should be looking at what they can do to deal with it. And and I don't think the answer is more handouts from the federal government to the Atlantic provinces, because that puts off, I think, any desire to doing reform. And so I really think that there is some serious issues for the Atlantic, but they're very rich. They have a lot of resources. They have a number of great opportunities available to them. And in fact, there's a lot of things they could do together as a region as opposed to acting as separate small provinces. Don't forget, we're talking about 2 million people living in the Atlantic. And so there's no reason that they can't share some of their resources better. For example, having one power company instead of 4 power companies. There's things that they could think of on a regional basis. But I also think they need to think about the levers that they can achieve. And in fact, if the federal government transferred tax points to the provinces, I wouldn't have a problem with that instead of transfers, because that gives more freedom to the provinces to design the personal tax system that they would like to have.
So you mentioned about signaling Canada needing to show the world that it's open for business. This was actually a topic that came up in some of the conversations this morning among some, that tax policy itself, independent of the actual incentives and the marginal effective tax rates and so on, it is a signal to Canadians, but also the world about our being open for business. And so there's, I guess technically not a question here, but someone agreeing with that observation, and therefore is a reason not to maybe worry about revenue neutrality. But is tax policy perhaps the best way to signal we're open for business relative to other types of policies? It's very simple and transparent. When you just lower the rate, you do that very quickly. Or are there changes on the regulatory side that could be done quickly as a signal, putting aside the actual underlying incentives and policy details?
I think, first of all, as I keep mentioning, is there's many things on the agenda that need to be looked at for productivity, and it's not one button. And I like to keep emphasizing that point over and over again. But taxation can be, as we've seen with a number of countries, can be very powerful. And it is a very important, I think, a very important part of the agenda, but not the only part of the agenda. So I do, and when you look at particularly the cases of Ireland and Estonia as well, and some other countries that I've worked with over the years myself on various missions, you know, you make certain changes to the tax system that could be very powerful. One of my most successful missions was in Bulgaria, where they had a corporate income tax rate of 38%. This was in 1998. And, you know, they had these tax holidays that weren't really working all that well. And, you know, they had all these conditions attached to it and things like that, all the tax holidays. And it was costing them a lot of money, and they weren't really attracting that much investment. And so the idea was to try to get them out of the tax holidays and into something better. And what they did is they actually followed what I suggested, which is to put a cap on the tax holiday based on how much investment takes place. So it became kind of like expensing investment instead. And at the same time, with all the revenue they would save, I suggested dropping the corporate tax rate to 20%. And I remember the investment promoter for the government, he was screaming at me, "This is a crazy idea, we're going to lose all this foreign direct investment, et cetera, et cetera." But what happened actually, Bulgaria not only went to 21 or 22%, which I recommended, they went to 15%, kind of like the Irish. And they got rid of the tax holidays. They put the limit on the tax holidays, as I suggested. But they also carried out, they had a huge deficit and high inflation before I arrived. And they created a monetary union with the European Union at that time, and they were trying to get access to the membership in the EU as well. But the main point is that they ended up getting a big bang in foreign direct investment. And that's why I think there's really two choices. You can have, on the spending side, you create a bunch of investment tax credits and growth funds and you know, sustainability development funds, and pick this industry and pick that industry by government to try to promote investment. Or you try to take a hands-off approach and you say, let's have policies that are really going to encourage investment instead in all industries. We're not going to pick which industries are going to grow, because frankly, you got to get all the pistons going and not just one piston on the airplane going.
So I guess final question, our last minute here, touches on the point about how there being many issues that policymakers need to grapple with today, and perhaps one of the largest ones is not so much an economic or productivity issue, but a broader geostrategic military security issue, and the need to spend more on Canada's defense, not only just to meet the 2% target that we have committed to, but now many other countries going beyond that. The United Kingdom committing to 2.5.
Yeah, 2.7 or something.
Also conversations among other NATO members whether the target among member countries should rise to 3 or beyond. Any suggestions on how defense spending can, I guess, fit into the fiscal capacity, fiscal framework here that we're talking about, and maybe even connected to that on this broader topic of how should we think about defense spending or defense policy in conjunction with productivity growth and economic outcomes?
Well, first of all, 2% is now old news. We keep talking about it in Canada, but it's gone. That's not going to. Europeans have already agreed to a 3% target, and of course Trump's talking about 5, which hardly any, there's only a couple. I think Poland is the only, maybe one other country that are at 5% today. Even the U.S. isn't even at 5% of GDP. But I think I would say I could see 3% now is already the new target. It's not quite official yet, but I think it will. The NATO countries will be agreeing to that. So we will have a challenge to doing that. But first of all, on the military side, there's. I was listening to the leadership debate, and somebody said, "Well, why don't we'll just raise salaries of all the soldiers?" And I'm thinking to myself, "Well, this isn't really expanding your defense. This is just adding the cost to it." Anyway, which I thought was a rather strange proposal, but we do, if it's the idea we want to attract more people into the Air Force, fine, but we got to have things for doing that are going to be effective. There's no question that the North and the Arctic is critical. It's important to not only us, but it's also important to the defense of North America as a whole. Because right across that big Arctic Sea is another country which is not a friend right now. It's a foe. I think it starts with an R, that country, the name of that country. And so we do have a responsibility. And the Americans look at what we're doing as not very helpful. In some ways, we are helpful with NORAD and some of the work that we're doing with them, and we have made some commitments to improve NORAD, but obviously we have some responsibilities there to do. And I saw a very interesting article where we have one heavy icebreaker in the north and 8 other icebreakers, which isn't bad, total 9. But the Russians have like 4 or 5 heavy icebreakers. And the Chinese have 1. And so you start adding up what the Chinese and what the Russians have. It's actually quite a significant number of icebreakers they have for the Arctic. And of course, missiles can come over the north, and that's why NORAD is so important. So we do have some obligations. It's a different world today. The peace dividend, as I've written about, is gone, unfortunately. And it means that it's going to cost us money, because the peace dividend that came after the fall of the Soviet Empire was in 1990 is a major loss really for the world, because now we're getting countries spending more money on military defense, and that's not a happy thing. But as you point out, we should use that expenditure for other purposes that can improve our productivity, including the way that we procure it, how we encourage innovation associated with defense. Tom Jenkins years ago had a commission that talked about having innovation as being one of the criteria for spending on military. We don't have that in our regional benefits program or anything like that. And so there are things that we can consider in terms of leveraging that expenditure to our advantage in other ways. Because when you look at history over the past 4,000 or 5,000 years, military expenditure has actually been one of the major sources of innovation in the world. Even the laptop computer came out of Stanford because the U.S. Army wanted to have some means of carrying a computer rather than having those big things, luggy things sitting in a room. And they gave money to Palo Alto to figure out how we can get something that's going to work. So when you have necessity, you then start looking at innovation or doing things differently that can have very significant innovation spillover effects. We're going to have to make room for that expenditure. But again, if you have a more productive economy and a faster growing economy, you'll have the revenues coming in to help pay for some of that expense.
Well, on that note, I think we will conclude here. So thank you, Jack, for a fascinating presentation, and thank you to everyone here for the insightful questions and insightful answers. So please join me in thanking Professor Mintz.